Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Psychological First Aid Supporting Others in Managing Stress. I'm Blake Cush, I'm the Director of Training and Outreach at OVS. As we've said before on some of our other webinars recently, we understand that programs are under some unique forms of stress during this time, and today's webinar is actually our fifth in the new Resilience webinar series, which was developed with the goal of helping you tackle some of these pressing issues. So a full list of those trainings that are remaining in the series are on your screen now. You can also learn more about them, register some of the upcoming ones at ovs.ny.gov/training. I'll put a link to that in the chat feature. If you'd like to chime in with some questions throughout today's presentation, please use the chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. You hover over, and there's a little call out button you can click on that'll pop up and give you some of the text that you have an opportunity to read that we share, also a chance for you to ask questions to us. So take advantage of that feature if you can. So like I said, all the webinars in our series are being recorded, including today's, and they're made available on that training page, and they can also be accessed via our OVS Training YouTube channel. Take advantage of that. A lot of people have really taken advantage of some of our recent ones, in particular our self-care one that was also led by IDMH. So we really hope you'll take advantage of those that are available to you, those resources. We also want to remind you that today we're offering increased access to our consultants from the OVS Training and Technical Assistance Request Program, or our TARP program, through some individual and small group coaching sessions. That's on the next slide too, or it's up on your screen right now. So this is a additional feature that's free. It's a free resource that you can access it from our training page as well. But our consultants in this program have made themselves available during this for a lot more than just our traditional TARP requests that come in, though those are still available as well. So we really, really hope you'll take advantage of some of those additional resources that we're putting out there for you guys during these what seem to be kind of crazy times. So finally, as you exit today's webinar, you'll be automatically directed to an evaluation survey on the presentation. Please don't just click out on this. We actually really do use the feedback we gain from these SurveyMonkey evaluations, and we share it directly with all of our presenters, and it helps us really polish and improve things. It helps us eliminate beeping sounds that come in on some of the previous webinars that we've hosted. So just some tips and tricks that we're able to navigate. We know it's not perfect, but if there's anything we can do to improve, we're always looking for your feedback. So please take advantage of that opportunity to share some thoughts. You'll also have a chance actually at the very end of the evaluation to share your information, your contact information, if you're interested in receiving more follow-up on either this training topic or a variety of some other ones as well. So please take advantage. So as we mentioned earlier, today's webinar is going to be led by the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, and actually it's going to be ran by Dr. Amy Nitze, who is the director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. Dr. Nitze is a psychologist who specializes in providing mental health training in academic and non-academic settings, both nationally and internationally, with an emphasis on disaster mental health and trauma recovery. She's currently collaborating with UNICEF USA to develop and implement a program of mental health support for children impacted by Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Amy's also the author and editor of numerous publications, including the recent book, Disaster Mental Health Case Studies, Lessons Learned from Counseling in Chaos. Without further ado, I'd like to turn everything over to Dr. Amy Nitze. Welcome.
Thanks, Blake. Good morning. Nope, it's afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to attend. IDMH is really pleased to be able to collaborate with OVS to do these, to participate in this series. And I don't know how many of you were on last week, but Dr. Vermeulen did a great job of setting the stage for this presentation by talking about the importance of self-care and giving some tools and strategies for that. And so that's going to feature quite a bit in the presentation today in terms of the importance of taking care of yourself in order to be able to support the people around you. And so I'm going to try to build off of the foundation that she laid during that presentation as I go through the presentation today. So you'll see on your screen the objectives for today. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just briefly touch on what we expect to be typical reactions after disasters and traumatic experiences, including the current one that we're all experiencing, and then talk a little bit about what psychological first aid is and why it can be particularly useful in the current situation, and then talk through the elements of PFA and how to do those. So we'll spend most of our time on that. So I'm going to go ahead and shut my camera off while I do this, and I'll turn it back on again at the end when we do the Q&A. Okay. So just starting again by talking about some of the reactions that we can expect people to experience. And it's important, that's an important principle in and of itself, that the reactions that people are experiencing in a situation like the one we're in now, or any disaster or trauma situation, are really what we would say are normal reactions to abnormal experiences, or typical or expected reactions to those kind of experiences. And so having a reaction or having a set of symptoms around something like what we're going through now is not necessarily an indication of a disorder or of any pathology, but it's our body and our brain's way of coping and responding to the stress that we're experiencing. So along with that is the point that people are going to experience and manifest symptoms very differently. And those could be cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms. We'll talk about those in a minute, but there's not one way that this is going to manifest for people. And I think probably for all of us now, if you just consider the people in your own home, if you're living with other people, people are dealing with this situation very differently, and the symptoms kind of come and go, or the stress reactions kind of come and go over the course of a day or a week. And they come and go, and they may change. So for most people, over the time of an event and the recovery after the event, their reactions will fade, and they'll return back to normal or something that looked like normal over time. But there will be people who don't experience that recovery or don't experience it as quickly. And those are people for whom professional support might be beneficial. So I mentioned a second ago, reactions can come in different realms of people's lives. I think the one that's the most commonly thought of, or the easiest to understand for people, are the emotional reactions. And those can really be, I think what I want you to hear here is that those can really be anything, any emotion from anger to sadness, anywhere in that sort of continuum is something that could be a normal or expected reaction to this. Whatever the reaction is, often we can put them in one of two categories: either feeling too much, so feeling overwhelmed, the feelings come on in a very strong way, or feeling not enough. I have that in quotes, but that means that you're sort of, your emotions are muted or constricted, or even sometimes people get to the level of sort of a dissociation, which is disconnecting from their emotions altogether. And then I think one that I really wanted to highlight here is the idea of emotional dysregulation. So when we're experiencing the level of stress that many people are under right now, the balance in our brains between the sort of emotional mind and the cognitive mind gets out of whack. And because of that, our normal processes for emotion regulation also get a little skewed. And so people might feel really dysregulated, or they might see the people around them being dysregulated. And that is, can be really difficult and uncomfortable and distressing to feel. It can also be uncomfortable and distressing to be living with people who are experiencing that. In terms of cognitive symptoms, a lot of the symptoms that people may be experiencing are for the same reason as the emotional dysregulation I just described. And what I mean is the cognitive or the rational part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part that regulates our executive function. So this is things like planning and decision making, thinking through the consequences of our action, memory, concentration. Those kind of things are all controlled by a part of the brain that can be disrupted and can go offline when someone's having a really strong stress reaction. And so often when people experience these kind of cognitive symptoms, they feel sort of like they're going crazy, because all of a sudden they're not able to remember something, or their concentration goes goes away, and they're not going crazy, most likely. This is an expected disruption in our executive function. The other cognitive symptoms can come around negative self-talk, or this idea of irrational beliefs, where we're sort of trying to make sense of what's happening to us and trying to make sense of the experience around us. And because of that, our messaging to ourselves, or the story that we tell ourselves to help make sense of it, can become irrational. It can become blaming of ourselves or blaming of other people in a way that can become disruptive. And then there are also lots of issues potentially around guilt and shame, performance guilt. This, in the current context, this can be guilt around worrying that you have gotten someone else sick, or that you've unintentionally become a carrier of the virus, something like that. Behavioral symptoms, people can start to engage in behaviors that are intended to sort of avoid more distress, but those avoidance symptoms can become, or those avoidance behaviors can then in and of themselves become disruptive. Interpersonal behavioral changes in terms of irritability, more frequent conflict, interpersonal conflict, and then a set of behavioral symptoms around being super hypervigilant, being sort of always looking over your shoulder, worrying that something bad is going to happen. And when you're in that place of being hypervigilant, you can become even more sort of irritable and feel like you're on edge, which can then lead to more interpersonal conflict. So those set of symptoms can kind of feed on each other. And then any range of physical symptoms can be associated with the stress hormones that circulate when we're in that period of acute or even chronic distress. That can be anything from gastrointestinal symptoms to headache and those kind of things. Also somatization, so expressing our emotional distress in a physical way. And then sleep disturbance. And one of the things we know in terms of treating distress and trauma exposure is that sleep disturbance is a symptom that can hang on even after other symptoms have been resolved. It can be particularly hard to treat the sleep disturbance angle of this, so that can become that can obviously then add more distress. When people aren't getting enough sleep, other things don't work well either. And then finally, in terms of spiritual symptoms, or spiritual changes or reactions, I guess I should say, this can come in different ways. Some people can sort of double down on their faith system, on their belief system, and really re-engage with it, or engage with it in a more deep way than they have before, or increase their spiritual practices, such as prayer or whatever those are. But other people can kind of take a step back from them and start to question their belief structure and question the things that they've been relying on in the past. And that can also, again, increase people's level of distress. So those can really go either way, and they have the potential to sort of strip away one good set of coping mechanisms that people have had in the past. So those are all reactions that we would talk about across any type of disaster, but we wanted to talk a little bit about outbreak-specific stressors, and this is something that Carla spent a lot of time on in the previous presentation. But the thing about this disaster is that the people that we're trying to help or support are experiencing the same things that we are, and so that level of overlap between what we're experiencing as people who are helpers and what the people we're trying to help are experiencing is largely the same set of experiences, which is so much different than many other situations that we all find ourselves in. But I think the big theme around the pandemic and the associated sort of lockdown situation is, well, there are several, but the general uncertainty of this and the lack of the ambiguity of it, and the lack of knowing what's, whether you might have been exposed or not, and when is this going to end, that level of uncertainty and ambiguity and lack of a clear endpoint can be particularly distressing. And we also know that social connections are one of the things that and feeling a sense of belonging and connectedness, those are one of the best things that we can do to improve the chances of a positive outcome after a traumatic situation. And so when you add the social distancing and the stay-at-home order on top of the outbreak itself, then you get an additional combination of emotional distress factors. And then I think we've probably all experienced the flood of information that keeps coming and the changes that come in terms of the instructions of what we need to do to care for ourselves, what the actual symptoms of this virus are. I just learned the other day about something with your toes, and there's some symptom now that they've listed as an actual symptom that's around people's toes, and I don't understand what it is. But so for me, that's a sort of a confusing message that adds another layer of things I need to worry about, right? I was literally looking at my son's toes last night, trying to figure out if anything looked abnormal about them. So there's this level of confusion there that adds to people's uncertainty. So where this leaves us is this constant need to adapt to so many things, so many changes all at the same time in our home life, in our work life, in our sense of safety in the world. And all of this ratchets up our baseline stress levels. And so we're sort of all living with this heightened baseline level of distress. And then we're adding on to that any acute stressors that come up, either related to the virus or related to other things in our lives. So we're living with this sort of acute on chronic level of distress that I think for a lot of us is much higher and much more intense than we're used to. So the good news is that psychological first aid is a tool that we can use to support each other, and that can be the people around us in terms of colleagues, in terms of our clients, in terms of the people in our households. And so, and it's an intervention, it's not a clinical intervention. It's an intervention that can be used by anyone, with anyone. And so I'm going to talk to you now about what that is, and then we'll get into the actual elements of it. So as I just said, psychological first aid is not a clinical or an emergency psychiatric intervention. It's a humane, supportive response to a fellow human being who is in suffering and is in need of support. So that's a definition from the UN. But I think it summarizes well. It's just how do you provide emotional support broadly defined, and we'll talk more about that, to someone around you who's suffering, and perhaps in that process you can mitigate a more negative long-term outcome from occurring. And as I said, it can be used to help and support anyone, and it can be used at any time. And I think that's particularly important and relevant now, because this disaster that we're going through, that we're living through, is we don't know the end point. And a lot of what I would say are typical disasters have a clear end point at which we can start to help people heal and recover. And because this one doesn't have that clear end point, we may need to be supporting each other in this way for quite a while. And it's less about a technique or a specific intervention than a set of tools and sort of a attitude with which you approach and support those around you. I think thinking of psychological first aid in a similar way as physical first aid is one way to help conceptualize it well. So with physical first aid, we can teach that to anyone, and they can use those skills to sort of stop the bleeding, if you will, until you can get to professional help. And psychological first aid is very similar. So it's a tool that can be used by anyone to help in the immediate term, and perhaps then, if needed, if that's not sufficient, to get somebody to professional help. So it's very focused, I just said this, on the immediate needs. It's a short-term intervention focused on the here and now. not on things that happened to people in the past, or it's not an attempt to fix problems that were present before the disaster occurred. And one thing that's really important about this is that there's a really clear relationship between our practical needs, our physical needs, and our emotional needs. And so when using PFA, attending to some of those practical or physical needs that people have can also indirectly really support their emotional needs and promote their emotional recovery. And so the goal is really to remove barriers to people's natural recovery mechanisms kicking in, and to return them, this is important, to return them to their pre-event level of functioning. So this is not an intervention that looks at opening up past wounds or previously existing problems. And it's not a series of steps. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's more helpful to talk about it as a toolkit, and you would choose which of the tools in the toolbox to use based on the needs of the person in front of you, and those may be quite different based on the reactions that that individual is having. And there may be times when some of the tools are more relevant and useful than others. But whatever your professional role is, understanding and thinking about why people are reacting the way they do under stress, and having some tools and feeling prepared to be able to address those levels of distress will allow you to respond to people's strong emotional reactions that otherwise can feel troubling or challenging to deal with. I think this slide is a summary of the things that we've talked about so far, providing immediate support in the face of a stressful event that helps activate people's natural recovery processes and reduces the risk of negative outcomes in the longer term. So how do we do that? So usually when I teach PFA, I say that this slide is the most important slide in the presentation, and I think it's probably true again today. So the best experts in the world got together in 2007 and said, what do we know about what people need in terms of promoting mental health recovery following a disaster or a traumatic event? And this list of 5 things is what they came up with as what we now consider the evidence-based principles of early intervention following a disaster. And so those 5 things are: people need a sense of safety, and that includes both being safe and perceiving yourself to be safe. And it's hard for any other recovery or healing to happen when people aren't feeling safe, because when people don't feel safe, they're in this heightened sort of fight or flight mode, and people can't start to recover when they're in that fight or flight mode. That's particularly tricky in the current situation, and so safety has become sort of a relative term, and it's hard to know when you're actually safe. But working on giving people the tools to be as safe as they can and to perceive themselves as being in control of their own sense of safety might be the best we can do in this situation. Relatedly is promoting a sense of calm. So once the immediate danger has passed and people are safe, people can still have a heightened level of anxiety or that fight or flight arousal that I mentioned just a second ago. And when people are in that state, whether they're actually safe or whether they're still in danger or the danger is over, when they're in that heightened state, they can't really start to move to the next level of safety. And so promoting a sense of calm in the person in front of you, which is often done by you remaining calm yourself and being a calm presence, is really crucial, which goes back to the presentation that Carla gave last week, and the importance of you taking care of yourself so that you can feel calm, you can feel regulated, emotionally regulated, to be able to do this work to support other people. The third one is a sense of efficacy, both in yourself and in the community. So disaster situations strip our sense of control away from us, our sense that we're sort of in charge of our world on a daily basis. I mean, I think a lot of us have experienced that in a new way during this pandemic. Our usual routines, our usual way of functioning in the world has been switched up or even stripped away. And so there's a sense of feeling out of control that comes along with that. And so helping people restore one's sense of efficacy in solving problems, in regulating their emotions, in getting their life back together is super important. The next one is promoting connectedness, and I mentioned this a second ago. This is what we know. This probably is the one of these 5 principles that has the most empirical support. We know that the more connected people feel to other people, the more likely it is that they're going to have a better recovery emotionally from a disaster or a traumatic situation. And we also know that this disaster has really changed the ways that we're able to do that. So this is one that needs particular attention in the current climate. And then the last one is instilling hope. And I think what I typically say about this is that if you have been working to address the other 4 principles, that those things also work to reinstill a sense of hope in people's lives. So the reason I say that this is the most important slide is that if whatever you're doing to support the people around you is working toward one of these 5 principles, then you're on the right track. Because we know this is what people need, and the way that you go about doing that might be messy or it might be incomplete. But if you're targeting one of those things, you're doing good. But I'm going to talk to you now about how the elements of PFA are built to help elicit these 5 principles. Okay, so these are the elements, and these elements, again, they're not a series of steps. So they don't necessarily go in order, and people may not need all of them at the same time, or they may not need all of them, period. So even though we have them laid out in this format, I really want you to think of them as tools in a toolkit. And I'm going to talk about each of them in a little more depth now. Okay, so the first element is providing comfort care, and really the big intervention here is being calm and promoting a sense of calm, which is what I mentioned just a minute ago. The situation that we're in now, and all disasters and trauma situations, increase that level of arousal, and anxiety is contagious. And so if one person isn't calm, whether that is you or the person, someone else around you, that can tend to sort of escalate the anxiety level of everyone involved. And so you really being a calming presence is one of the best things that you can do to help other people. And we know that there are mirror neurons in the brain that actually wire up to mirror the emotions of the people across from us. And so if one person is calm and one person is anxious and really emotionally heightened, one of 2 things is going to happen. Either the person who's calm is going to start to become agitated and start to mirror the arousal of the person in front of them, or vice versa. The person who is emotionally heightened is going to slowly start to slow down, to calm down, and to mirror the sense of calm in the person around them. So it's important, again, to be really mindfully present in the moment when you're doing this kind of work, when you're interacting with somebody with the intent of helping them, both in the moment and, again, long-term, taking care of yourself so that you're able to access that calm place for yourself. Also, the idea of warmth and genuineness, and I know that this is, sometimes we call this slide Social Work 101 or Counseling 101, but people really do benefit from a genuine, warm presence of another human being who's interested and paying attention to them. So you just giving another person the gift of being fully present with them and remaining focused on them and on the conversation that you're having with them goes a long way. The second element of PFA is recognizing and attending to people's basic needs, and that includes their safety needs. I think I've mentioned this previously in this presentation enough that I don't have to go into depth here, but what can you do in the current very complicated context around safety to help ensure that people are feel safe? And I know for myself, I have 2 kids at home, and my son is 14, and of the 4 of us in my home right now, he's the one that's the most anxious about this. And so he was upset that I was even coming to the office today. So I showed him that I was getting out my gloves to put on to come into the office, and I assured him that there was hand sanitizer right inside the doorway that I could, in my building, that I could use as many times as I need to, and that I wouldn't go anyplace else. So I walked through with him what I was doing, why I was coming here, and the steps I was going to take to keep myself safe. And that was my attempt to meet his need for safety in this situation. We also know that people do better in terms of feeling safe when things are as predictable and structured as possible. And so encouraging people to find ways to build structure and routine and predictability back into their lives in this situation where it feels really unpredictable, and where probably all of us have experienced that trying to maintain our old routines can be a challenging thing to do. So reminding people of that and helping them problem solve around that can be very beneficial. Helping to solve problems is another basic, another tool for attending to people's basic needs. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of the cognitive symptoms that we can experience related to a disaster like that, our usual well-functioning selves that can solve problems to help us get to our day, that part of our brain that does that for us can really be disrupted by the level of distress that we're under. And so people who can usually make good, solid decisions for themselves may find themselves not able to do so. And they may not, and that's a temporary, probably, most likely a temporary condition. But so you helping channel that for people, helping them reestablish a sense of decision making, or walking them through the steps that they might otherwise be able to do for themselves is can be a really valuable thing that helps with basic logistical needs. And when I train counselors, we teach them to use open-ended questions rather than yes or no questions or questions with choices. But in this context, that's sort of flipped on its head. So open-ended questions can even increase people's anxiety. If we're not functioning well, if we're not problem solving well or able to concentrate, then sometimes a list of choices, would you like to do A, B, or C, or maybe even would you like to do A or B, can offer a lot of comfort and relief to people. Whereas an open-ended question where the choices are endless, like what would you like to do? Do you have any ideas? That can increase people's distress because they're struggling with decision making anyway. And this last point, break down the brick wall. So this is a metaphor for saying things can feel really overwhelming to people, and the number of decisions that we're all having to make now that are different than the decisions we had to make before, and the number of different problems that we have to solve on a daily basis that are different than what we had to do before can really feel overwhelming. And so it can just be as if there's sort of a brick wall between you and sort of normal functioning, right? And so how can you help people sort of break down that wall and organize those piles of bricks into what feel like solvable chunks? And okay, so today, all I need to worry about is the groceries and this one, assignment I have due for school. And the other piles that feel overwhelming and distressful, I can put those away and deal with those tomorrow. That kind of thing is what people might need help with in the current context that they otherwise wouldn't necessarily need help with. Validating survivors' thoughts and feelings. So this is probably, for me, one of the most important ways that you can be useful to someone else. And they're probably all important. I think I've said that three times on 3 different ones. So we'll just say they're all important. But this is a new and confusing experience for a lot of us, for most of us. and giving people the opportunity just to talk about what they're feeling, maybe identifying even for the first time what they're feeling and putting words to it, can really jumpstart the healing process. That does not mean that you should push someone to talk when they're not ready to talk, but if they are ready to talk, you can be ready to listen. And the experience of just feeling heard and understood is a powerful one. And people might start to minimize their distress. They might tend to compare their experience to other people's, and then therefore feel like they don't really have the right to feel how they're feeling. And so encouraging people to talk and validating that their loss, their pain, their anxiety is real and it's distressing, regardless of what's happening to someone else, can be powerful as well. Empathy versus sympathy. So what people really need in a context like this is empathy, you listening to them and demonstrating that you heard them and that you can grasp what it is that they're feeling, versus sympathy, which is more about feeling sorry for people, right? And expressing empathy is really, it's the skill of reflecting feelings. So when someone's telling you how they're feeling, the response is to reflect back to them the feeling that you heard them say. And so, but that's not always how we talk to each other in day-to-day conversation. So if this isn't something that you're used to doing, if it's not a part of your daily role and your daily professional role, it can feel a little awkward. So the phrases that we have listed here on this slide are just ways that you can start an empathy statement in a way that allows you to frame your response to people that way. So all you have to do is say something like, so you're really feeling overwhelmed today and you're not sure which task to tackle first. Or it sounds like today you're just feeling really sad and alone. That last bullet, or that last sub-bullet, so tell me if I'm getting this right. You seem to be feeling blah, blah, blah. So that is a way of checking in and identifying that you may have, that you really are trying hard to understand a person's experience. Now, something I really want you to hear as I talk about this is that it's okay to get the feeling wrong. You might get it wrong. So you might say, wow, it sounds like you're really feeling sad and alone. And the person might say back, actually, no, I'm not sad. I'm angry. Actually, that's not a bad outcome of you reflecting, attempting to reflect a feeling. When the survivor clarifies, no, I'm not sad, I'm angry. That helps you understand, clarifies it for you, but it also can help clarify it for them. And that being able to really name and identify what it is that you're experiencing is an important part of the recovery process for people. So if you get it wrong, just say, oh gosh, I'm sorry, thank you for clarifying. So what you're really feeling is a lot of anger. And then move on. There are some phrases that we tend to use that are attempts to be helpful, attempts to show support to other people, but end up feeling, making people feel dismissed or invalidated. So sort of the opposite of what you're attempting to do. And the reason this list is on here is because these are things that, that we've actually heard people say, or to be honest, that we've said, right? So the first couple around don't feel bad or don't cry. Well, if telling people not to feel what they're feeling actually worked, we wouldn't need psychologists or counselors or mental health providers in the world. If it was that simple, if my son was sad and I said, don't feel sad, and he was like, okay, thank you, I'm not sad anymore. Yeah, that would be fantastic, but it doesn't work. And so telling someone that they shouldn't feel what they're feeling really can just then add a layer of guilt, perhaps, that they shouldn't be feeling what they're feeling, and they're still stuck with that feeling as well. The same goes with don't cry. When we know that crying is actually physiologically helpful to people, and so telling someone not to do it can increase their shame and also inhibit their natural healing processes that they're going through. Try not to think about it, or let's talk about something else, that attempt to sort of change the subject. again, often doesn't work. People are still going to be thinking about whatever it is they were thinking about, but now they also feel bad and feel like they shouldn't be thinking about it. The next one up there at the top of the second column, I know how you feel. That's an attempt to express empathy usually, but it's so much more helpful because you might not know how they feel, and even if you do, it's a much more powerful intervention to use a reflection of feeling. So instead of saying, I know how you feel, demonstrate that you know by reflecting back to them what you heard them say. So instead of saying, I know how you feel, say, gosh, it sounds like you're really feeling alone. That way of expressing empathy has a much bigger impact. The next one about it's God's will, unless you are certified or ordained through some religious order of some sort to be able to say that, and you know that the person that you're talking to also subscribes to that same religious system or structure, then that is not a recommended thing to say. Then those last three all fall into the category, at least you still have this. If your sentence is about to start with the phrase at least, it's probably better not to say whatever it is that's going to follow that, because those tend to be really minimizing and make dismissive of the pain that someone's going through. The story I often tell here is that my sister lost her 16-year-old son a couple of years ago, and she also has 2 daughters. And the number of times that she heard from people in her own church, my sister is very active in her church, and people in her own church would say, well, at least you still have the girls. Meaning, yes, you lost your son, but you still have these 2 daughters, so it could be worse because he could have been your only child. My sister, bless her sweetheart, she's such a sweet person, she would never react overtly to show people the level of pain that induces in her, but that's an incredibly painful thing every time she hears it, because losing her son and having her daughters are 2 totally disconnected parts of her life, and it does not do anything to mitigate the loss of her son, knowing that she has her girls. So it's just an example that I offer to highlight why those statements can be not particularly helpful. So again, when you say these things, I still slip up and say these things. And people know that we mean well when we say them, but it's really a much more beneficial healing experience for people to express empathy through reflecting back to them what you hear them say. And the other point I want to make about this is that there are some questions that are just unanswerable. And so there's no magic wand, there's no magic thing that you can say that's going to fix people's pain or take their pain away. But you can be there with them while they struggle with those things. And so I just want to reinforce the fact that you don't need to know what to say to fix something, you just need to be there with them. So taking the old phrase, don't just stand there, do something, and turn it on its head. You don't necessarily you don't have to do something, just stand there, just be there with people as they're struggling with something. That's what they need from you. Just a couple notes about anger. That can be particularly challenging to deal with when people are really agitated or really angry, because they're going to channel it somewhere, and that the way that they channel it or the direction that they channel it may be a rational one or it may not be. Usually people are looking for someone to blame, somewhere to discharge their anger onto. And because you're in front of them, that may at times be you. And when it feels directed at you, it can be particularly hard to sit with and to do the things we talked about earlier about remaining calm and reflecting back what you heard the person say. Because our instinct in that moment is to become defensive or to shut down or something that's not just sitting and expressing empathy. I think the most important thing we can say about that is remember that it's not about you. I recognize that is easier said than done. But often angry people just need to feel heard and to say just to blow off steam and get it out of their system. And if you can manage to sit with that and let them do that without getting angry or defensive back, most often, that will be enough for them to start to calm back down. This is the idea of you remaining calm and them slowly, the mirror neuron thing I talked about earlier, them slowing down and being calm, instead of you reacting to their emotions and becoming agitated right alongside of them. I've made this point several times, so I don't need to belabor it here, but staying empathically engaged requires you to take care of yourself, because genuine empathy and genuine warmth are what's helpful. If you're just phoning it in or playing a role or saying the right words without the genuine presence around it, people will know that, and it will have less of an impact. Especially if you're doing this work every day and you're working with traumatized or distressed people daily as a part of your job. Keeping your own tank full so that you have something left to give to other people is incredibly important. And knowing your limits, knowing when you've had enough, is also a really important thing. Okay. The next element is connecting people with their support systems. And as I said earlier, this is what we know from a research perspective. We know that this is what people need. You can be the person that offers them support, or you can connect them with the natural support systems that they have in their lives. You may find that people don't want to burden other people with burden others with their problems. And so encouraging them to think about, what would you want if the roles were reversed? If you knew that someone in your life that you cared about was struggling, would you want them to reach out to you, or would you want them to hold back? Sometimes that shift in perspective can help people be willing to engage. At the same time, it's important to remember that not everybody in people's lives are able to provide positive support. So if people are resistant to reaching out to someone for support, it may be for an important reason. One of the things I think a lot of us are worried about in this context is increase in domestic violence and child abuse and that kind of thing, when people are unable to, when the general level of distress is heightened and people aren't able to separate or get away. And so certainly we don't want to encourage people to connect to a source of support that won't actually be supportive and that could be dangerous. Providing accurate and timely information is the next element on the list. In this current situation that we're in, this is can be, I think, one of the most powerful interventions. We know for sure that accurate information is an important antidote for anxiety. Ambiguity causes distress, and accurate information, is an antidote to that ambiguity. And so staying aware of if you're in the position of being a provider of this information, just staying on top of what's accurate and what's available in terms of guidance and guidelines is important. I know that's almost a ridiculous thing to say because things change so often. But we're all doing the best we can with that, I think. And presenting information in simple language and also providing it in writing if possible. So this goes back to the cognitive distress I mentioned earlier, where people's brains just aren't processing information in the same way that they otherwise do. And so you may say something to someone and they may forget it 5 minutes later and ask you the same question. And that's not because they're not paying attention, it's because their brains aren't processing the same way they usually do. And so having multiple ways for people to access information, such as telling them out loud and also handing them something in written form, that kind of thing. Rumor control is a big problem, or rumors are a big problem, and controlling that with by not spreading unconfirmed news or by just directly tackling rumors that you know to be only rumors and to be false is really important. And if you don't know the answer to someone's question, it's much better to say I don't know than to try to make something up. But it's even better to say, I don't know, but I'm going to try to find out and to seek out that information for them. Providing education about stress reactions. There's really a knowledge is power element to teaching people how stress works, how stress impacts our bodies and our minds, so that people feel like they have, this really relates to the principle of efficacy and self-efficacy that I mentioned as one of the 5 principles. When people understand what's happening to them, they have much more of a sense of control over it. So when you provide people with education, you're normalizing their reactions and helping them realize that what they're going through is expected, predictable, doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them or that they're going crazy. Explaining why the reaction that they're having makes sense, giving the circumstances, and then giving them some tools for managing that. So this is almost exactly what Carla's presentation on self-care was last week, an explanation of the different symptoms and reactions that we can be having in the current situation, why those are occurring, and then what are some tools for dealing with that. Also, providing education to parents about what's happening with their kids. So when kids are under distress and they start acting increasingly needy or clingy or forgetful, or they start regressing, appearing to at least regress in terms of their behavior and acting developmentally at a younger stage than they actually are, all that stuff can really increase parents' distress. And so just like knowledge is power about yourself, knowledge is power about what's happening to your kids. First, it can relieve kids' distress, or parents' distress, when they understand that what's happening to their kids is what we can expect will happen to their kids, and hopefully give them a little bit of increased patience when they understand that their kids aren't acting bad on purpose or intentionally irritating them. And it also offers relief when they realize that the children's behavior is probably temporary. So the next element is reinforcing strengths and positive coping strategies. Again, this goes back to the element of supporting self-efficacy that I talked about in those 5 principles. It's important to help people acknowledge and to reinforce their sense of strength, their coping skills, remind them of skills that they do have, strategies that they've used in the past to help them regain a sense of control. So you can ask questions like, how have you gotten through tough times before? Or what skills do you have that will allow you to get through this? In the current context, when the situation isn't over and when we're all trying to manage ourselves and develop coping skills just for getting through the situation, there's a set of skills. I directly pulled this from the strategy of stress inoculation that Carla talked about last week. But essentially in the current context, what we recommend in terms of helping people think through their coping strategy is to first help them identify which aspects of this do they have control over and which do they not have control over. It's a really important distinction because there are some things that we just do not have control over. And so fighting to gain control over something that we don't have control over is futile, and it increases our overall level of distress. So for those things that you don't have control over, it's about identifying coping strategies for tolerating them. But then for the things that we do have control over, then we might have a set of skills or a set of problem-solving strategies to actually manage and regain a sense of control over those things. But that starts, again, with the idea of breaking down everything that's going on into everything that's causing you distress into which things you have control over and which you don't. And the other thing that sort of a mantra that we use at IDMH is that effective coping is anything that makes you both feel better and function better. So there are certainly strategies that people attempt to use to cope that do perhaps make them feel better temporarily, but don't really help in the long run. And so reminding people about, or asking people to think about things that will help them feel better, but also help them function better can be useful. I put this list here. This is a list that we usually use of effective and ineffective coping. I almost took it out today because I think we've all seen a list like this about 150 times, and you could probably write this with your eyes closed, or tell me what this list is with your eyes closed. But I left it in because I think it's less about knowing what these things are and more about being reminded to use them when you're, and to think about what's keeping you from being able to do those things. So I know I need to turn the TV off or not scroll through the news feed on my phone. And I know that I should be doing more physical exercise in order to maintain my wellness during this time. So what's keeping me from not using those strategies? So I think seeing the list is a helpful way of prompting people to think about this. Okay. So just in terms of do's and don'ts, to sort of summarize the skills that we just talked about, when you are talking to people and attempting to offer them assurance and comfort and support, you want to be realistic about that and not overpromise or over-reassure. So, you know, saying everything is going to be great if you're not sure that everything is going to be great can be a risky thing to do. Or, you know, promising the kids that, you know, in 2 weeks they'll get to see their friends, if you're not certain that they really are going to get to see their friends in 2 weeks, can really undermine what you're trying to do with that person. Definitely validating the survivor's feelings. We spent a lot of time on that. That's a very important thing. And the flip side of that is what we don't want to do is do things that minimize their experience or minimize their loss, or compare their loss to that of other people. Do stay with the survivor's focus and don't try to change the subject. So changing the subject is often more about our discomfort and our not wanting to stay with the subject, and less about the needs of the client. If the client or the person you're trying to help is focused on something, stay with that to the degree that you can. Also, silence is okay. We don't do silence well a lot of times in our normal sort of colloquial conversation with each other, but sometimes silence is really what people need, with a compassionate presence, with the compassionate presence of someone else with them. And when people are angry, remember that they're venting, and try to stay with them as they do that without taking it personally or getting agitated yourself. So the bottom line, it's right at 2 o'clock. Okay, the bottom line, whatever your professional role, you can support the emotional needs of survivors, community members, and colleagues using the tools of PFA that we just discussed. So you don't have to be in the position of emotional support being your professional role in order to be able to help in that way. A supportive presence is an important aspect of recovery and healing. You don't have to solve their problems. You don't have to have the right answer. You don't even really have to know how to, be an expert at reflecting feelings, but just being there and being present and making that attempt is what people often need. And one more time, caring for yourself allows you to refill your tank so that you are able to continue to support others. So if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to go back and watch the presentation that Carla did last week, or whenever that was. Time is sort of running together. Okay, that was my presentation. I think now we have time for questions and comments.
Awesome. So I think what will happen is we'll have quite a few people who need to take off for 2 o'clock appointments. So we want to thank you, all of you, for joining us. Special thank you to Dr. Nitsa and the IDMH team for putting together today's webinar. We'll stay on. We'll still do some questions for you guys. We reserved the room for about 90 minutes, so we have another half hour if needed. So if you do need to leave, that's great. But please don't forget to take a few minutes to complete your webinar evaluation survey. Give us the feedback. We really appreciate it. Go to our VIP training page for more resources, updates on training opportunities. We have another one next week scheduled for on the topic of building and managing teams remotely, plus the building trauma-informed care environments for children is in 2 weeks, also with IDMH, and we'll put a link to some of those in the chat feature. But take a chance now if you want. We'll stick around, answer some questions. Just make sure in the chat feature you choose all participants, or excuse me, all hosts, so that we can, or all panelists, excuse me, so we can see all the questions as they come in and answer them as they come. Otherwise, thank you guys for joining us. So let's see here. Oh, of course, a couple questions about access to the PowerPoint presentation slides, and they are available on our website right now, and we'll also put in a link real quick. Rachel, if you want to do me a favor and share that again to everyone. Well, great feedback. Somebody said they're going to share their slides with their daughters who are dealing with these issues in their own homes. Wow. So this is wonderful to share. So kudos, Amy.
That's fantastic.
Will we put the PowerPoint or today's presentation on YouTube? Of course. It takes about a day for it to be exported and uploaded. So that and all of our webinars that were in the Resilience webinar series are actually on our YouTube channel right now. I'm going to share the self-care one with everyone right now. And any of our YouTube links as well, you can access back to the training channel to see all of the other ones that are available. Awesome. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing all that. While we wait for a few questions that come in, either Carla or Amy, do you want to pitch a sale a little bit for the Creating Trauma-Informed Environments for Children webinar that's coming up?
Sure. What I'm going to do there is really talk about, the basis for that will be the same, the 5 principles of early intervention that I mentioned midway through this presentation, but really talk about how you can use those 5 principles to create an environment for kids that's as much of a healing environment as you can for children in whatever setting. So whether that's a classroom or a boys and girls club or your house. So this isn't about therapy interventions with kids, but it's about creating environments for kids. And there will be some strategies in there, but to use with kids, but not clinical ones. So what can you do to really, as this is going on, to create an environment for kids that is as healing as possible?
Yeah, not a lot of questions. I mean, we can hang tight for a little while longer. Some of you are still in, we've lost about half the group, but if you have any other questions, we'll give you guys a couple more minutes. A few of you asked how to access the survey evaluation, and that is easily accessible as soon as you exit the webinar. We've designed it so that a pop-up window will come up as soon as you close out from WebEx.
You can't escape without.
Yeah, you can't escape it. All right, here we have a question. So how do you continue to provide the best services for your client when you yourself are scared about the coronavirus and getting it?
Yeah, I think that is really the question right now, right? I think this is the most common question that we get in terms of doing this work, and it's really the question everyone's asking themselves. So I don't want my answer to sound cliche, because the fear of this is, it's real. And so, but I think this goes back to really starting with yourself. So before you start to worry about services for your clients, what do you need to do for yourself in terms of those 5 principles that we talked about earlier to help yourself be as safe as possible, and whatever strategies you need to use to be as safe as possible? What do you need to do to help yourself feel calm and to feel in control? And maintaining your own sense of well-being by being connected to other people. So start with yourself. And then, I guess I want to give you permission to, to acknowledge your limits. And I think usually, owning that you're scared and owning that you're doing your best. Even, I don't know what your role, the person who asked this question, I don't know what your role is with the client, but if it's appropriate for you to say, this is scary and I'm overwhelmed too, and just kind of, not to turn the conversation about yourself, but just to acknowledge that this is difficult, probably will help the client feel understood and heard as well. But yeah, starting with caring for yourself and giving yourself permission to know your limits. I don't know, Carla, do you want to jump in on that at all?
No, I mean, I think that's, this is one of those unanswerable questions where we want to validate the question, as Amy was kind of saying, because it is absolutely a legit fear. And I think this is another area where really breaking down what can you control and what can't you control, and what specifically are you afraid of? Is it, what specifically about being able to continue to do your job? How are you afraid that is going to expose you to getting infected, and what can you do to control or limit that behaviorally? So just really kind of, reducing the actual threat as much as possible while giving yourself the permission to still have the concern about the things that you really can't control. So again, not a great answer because there is no real answer to this, unfortunately.
I have another question. I think it just went to me, so I'm not sure if you guys got to see it. For staff who have anxious temperaments themselves and default to escalating when clients express anger or anxiety, do you have any specific advice?
Yeah, I'm probably one of those people myself. I think it might help to conceptualize that in terms of short-term strategies and long-term strategies. So the short-term strategy is, what are the tools you can use in the moment when you're sitting with an anxious client or a client who's escalated or heightened in some way? What are those in the moment things that you can do? And the most important thing I can say about that is, to whatever strategy you choose, to practice it and rehearse it so that you can call on it in that moment. So this is something like a deep breathing practice or a muscle relaxation practice or some mindfulness tool that you can use, but you can't, because you're heightened as well, it's going to be hard for you to access that unless it's rehearsed and almost automatic for you. So a daily practice of whatever it is, whether it's deep breathing or whatever, so that it comes naturally to you, so that in the moment when you need it, you can access it. Which I guess then relates to my long-term thing, which is, what do you need to do long-term to tackle that anxiety? And anxiety is such a beast, right? It's such a painful experience for people. So whatever you can do in terms of, self-care practices or even professional intervention to help you learn to manage the anxiety long-term. But I think I want to reinforce practice, whatever your strategy is when you're not heightened, and then it'll be much more likely to come to you when you are. Anything else?
No, I think it's slowed and we've lost quite a bit of participants.
Yeah.
So, Amy, or the IDMH's information is on the screen there. If you need to follow up with any other questions as well, we're here as well, training@lps.ny.gov. But we want to thank you all for joining us. We'll export this as soon as we can, try to get a link for you if you want to share it with your colleagues within the next day or so. You'll also get an email after everything is set and published, announcing the links and everything for you to access then. But we appreciate you all joining us today and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.